Welcome back. And now for the news in detail. Russia has called for the resumption of peace talks between Taliban and the US. A foreign ministry spokesperson says a visiting Taliban delegation has repeated its willingness to continue the dialogue. The Taliban representatives arrived in Moscow yesterday, days after the US President Donald Trump said Afghan peace talks are dead. They met the Russian President's special envoy for Afghanistan, Zamir Kabulov. Taliban spokesperson Suhail Shaheen says the recent developments in the Afghan peace process were discussed in the meeting. Taliban media outlet, the Afghan Islamic Press, says the delegation also plans to visit China, Iran, and the Central Asian states as well. For more on this, we have been joined by Mr. James Dorsey, Singapore-based political analyst. Sir, thank you for taking time out for Indus News. First of all, the dialogue between the US and Taliban has concluded without any tangible results. Both the sides say they will no longer talk to end the war in Afghanistan. What effect do you think will this have on Afghanistan, especially when we talk about the presidential elections which are to be held sooner there?
Short term, I think we're going to see stepped up violence, both on the part of the Taliban and the way that the United States is likely to respond to it. Having said that, actually there was more or less an agreement. The Americans and the Taliban had agreed on the terms of a U.S. withdrawal, and President Trump is often speaks in superlatives, so I would not take his word dead literally necessarily. I think the fundamental problem here is twofold. One is on the part of what the Americans said to the Taliban, which is the Americans did not say you have to declare an end to the armed struggle. What they said was, we cannot tolerate you attacking our forces and others while we are talking, and that's not an unreasonable position to take. More fundamentally, of course, the projection of these peace talks was one in which it was about U.S. withdrawal rather than about the future of Afghanistan and the terms of that Afghans between each other would agree on for the future governance of the country.
Okay, Mr. James, as we know, Moscow has insisted both the US and the Taliban that they should resume the dialogue. Do you think the peace process will be revived anytime soon after the interest that has been shown by, or the urgency of this particular peace process that has been put forth by Russia as well?
I think there's several elements here. It's sort of typical. The Americans say one thing, the Russians will say the opposite. So obviously, after the President Trump canceled the talks with the Taliban, the Russians are going to say we should be talking. Now, having said that, I think both sides have a vested interest in talks. That is to say, President Trump has made a point in his electoral promises that he wants a withdrawal from Afghanistan prior to next year's U.S. presidential election. And he has not had many foreign policy successes, so he has an interest in getting these talks back on track. From the Taliban's perspective, getting the bulk of the foreign forces out of Afghanistan was one of their major objectives. Having said that, they're also in an advantageous position for the future of Afghanistan, precisely because the Americans have focused less on talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government and more on the aspect of a U.S. withdrawal.
Okay, Mr. James, as you already mentioned, that the problems are twofold regarding the peace talks between the Taliban and the U.S. So quickly, can you give us a little elaboration of those irritants which actually happened to, stall these talks?
Well, I think what prompted this was that on the Thursday before President Trump was supposed to meet with the Taliban leaders at Camp David outside of Washington, you had a Taliban attack in which a U.S. soldier was killed, as well as 11 others. Now, the Taliban obviously wanted to demonstrate their ability to attack and to increase pressure on the United States. The problem with it is it had exactly the opposite effect. It's delayed the talks.
Okay, thank you very much for your political insight, the political analyst based in Singapore, Mr. James Dorsey. Now we'll move on. New Delhi's decision to revoke occupied Kashmir special status has been challenged in India's Supreme Court. Jammu and Kashmir People's Conference filed the petition calling President's rule in the occupied valley unconstitutional and void. The petition said India does not have the power to arbitrarily change the political form of occupied Kashmir. It has been submitted that Kashmir has been locked down for more than 1 month, showing a constitutional change enacted against people's wishes. Earlier, several petitions were filed in India's Supreme Court after the revocation of the occupied Kashmir's special status. Members of the US Congress have reiterated their criticism of India's government for imposing a complete lockdown in occupied Kashmir. Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib has condemned India's revocation of occupied Kashmir's special status. In a statement, she also slammed the communications blackout India has imposed and its suppression of life-saving medical care. Tlaib demanded that India and its widespread violence, torture, and other human rights violations against Kashmiris. She urged New Delhi to accept responsibility for the violations and hold involved officials accountable. Meanwhile, a group of 7 congressmen have urged the US ambassadors to India and Pakistan to play their role in easing the tensions. In a letter, they asked the envoys to work for the restoration of communications and media access to Indian-occupied Kashmir. The congressmen strongly urged the Indian government to release thousands of arbitrarily detained Kashmiris. Members of the European Union Parliament have called for trade and travel sanctions on India over the alarming human rights situation in occupied Kashmir. Richard Corbett, co-chair of the Friends Group of Kashmir Group, called for utilizing all possible means to pressurize India to lift curfew in the valley. Addressing a conference organized in the European Parliament, Corbett proposed the imposition of trade sanctions on New Delhi. He also said travel restrictions for those involved in the acts of terrorism in Indian-occupied Kashmir should be imposed. Earlier, the EU members had a chance to meet the victims of unprovoked attacks from India on the line of control. Azad Jammu and Kashmir President Sardar Masood Khan was also present in the conference. Masood Khan welcomed the decision of European Parliament to hold a debate on the situation in occupied Kashmir. Israeli forces have shot and wounded 58 Palestinians during the weekly protests along the Gaza border. Palestinian officials said 3 of the protesters sustained serious wounds. The Gaza-based officials said 31 of the demonstrators were hit by live ammunition. They said another 27 were injured by rubber-coated rounds. Dozens of other Palestinian protesters fell ill after inhaling tear gas fired by Israeli troops. Israeli forces have killed over 300 Palestinians and wounded about 18,000 others since weekly protests began in March 2018. 5 major European nations have expressed deep concern about Israel's plan to annex parts of the occupied West Bank. In a joint statement, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and the UK said the annexation will be a serious breach of international law. The EU nations called on both the sides to refrain from actions which put the two-state solution for Palestine and Israel in jeopardy. Earlier, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said he will impose Israeli sovereignty on the Jordan Valley and northern Dead Sea if he is re-elected. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation has called an emergency meeting over Netanyahu's plan. 3 major European nations have urged Iran to return to compliance with the 2015 nuclear accord. France, Britain, and Germany have called on Iran to cooperate with the International Atomic Energy Agency. The EU members have expressed deep concern over the IAEA's report that advanced centrifuges have been installed at Natanz. These countries say they support the nuclear deal and urge Iran to stick to the agreement. Last week, IAEA Chief Cornel Furuta visited Tehran to check Iran's nuclear programs. The nuclear watchdog said the installation of advanced centrifuges to produce enriched uranium will lead to increased production. Resuming our news bulletin with a story from Hong Kong, where the clashes have erupted between pro and anti-government protesters in a shopping mall. Hong Kong police moved in to break up the scuffles and detained several demonstrators. An angry push and pull tug between rival demonstrators was marked more by shouting than violence. Parts of Hong Kong have been paralyzed over the past 3 months due to protests and street battles between the demonstrators and police. The protests started after the government introduced a bill that would have allowed the extradition of people to mainland China. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan says he will discuss purchasing Patriot missiles from the US with President Donald Trump. In an interview, Erdogan said his personal bond with Trump can avert potential US sanctions over Turkey's buying the Russian S-400 air defense system. He said it is not rational for the US to hurt longtime ally Turkey with sanctions. Talking about the Syrian refugee crisis, Erdogan warned Turkey would allow refugees to cross into Europe if it does not get more financial assistance. He said Turkey has spent $40 billion to cope with the people fleeing the Syrian civil war. US has imposed sanctions on 3 North Korean groups allegedly involved in hacking international bank accounts. The US official says the hacking groups are perpetrating cyber attacks to support illicit weapon and missile programs. The Treasury Department says the groups are controlled by North Korea's Intelligence Bureau. The action blocks any US-related assets of the groups and prohibits dealing with them. Earlier, Pyongyang denied UN allegations regarding obtaining $2 billion through cyber attacks on banks and cryptocurrency exchanges. Russia says it is ready for the talks with Ukraine, but has 3 preconditions before it agrees to attend the summit. A senior Kremlin aide says no date has been fixed for the summit of the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, France, and Germany. In the first condition, the Russian president's aide says the rival armed forces in eastern Ukraine should be separated across the line of contact. Russia also wants agreed wording on special status for the Donbass region and a preliminary agreement on the summit's conclusions. Earlier, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said sanctions on Russia must remain in place until peace is restored. Drone attacks have been launched on 2 oil facilities in eastern Saudi Arabia, sparking fires. The Interior Ministry says the blazes at the 2 Saudi Aramco units in Abqaiq and Khurais provinces have been brought under control. The 2 eastern provinces contain the world's 2 largest oil processing plants. Yemen's Houthi rebels have claimed the responsibility for the attacks, saying 10 drones were used. Earlier in Yemen, 9 civilians have been killed after Houthi rebels attacked residential areas in the port city of Hodeidah. A government official says 10 others were injured after the rebels fired artillery shells at the district of Tuyata. The shelling occurred hours after the UN appointed Abhijit Guha as the new head of the Hodeidah mission. Hodeidah's residents say rebels have intensified attacks on government military sites in recent weeks. In the latest ceasefire violation in northwest Syria, the government forces have killed 5 civilians in shelling near a Turkish military observation post in Idlib province. The Syrian Human Rights Observatory says the army's artillery barrages have also targeted rural areas of Aleppo, Hama, and Latakia. It says the rebels also fired on government positions in the recently captured town of Khan Sheikhoun in Idlib. The monitors say there are no reports of casualties yet. Meanwhile, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called for a probe into a series of attacks on hospitals in Idlib. In another development, the presidents of Russia, Turkey, and Iran will meet in Ankara on Monday. Officials said they will discuss fighting in Idlib, the Syrian refugee crisis, and a political settlement to the conflict. In Libya, 3 Eastern Forces members have been killed in a drone strike on a town southeast of Tripoli. Libya's government says the drone targeted a command vehicle in the rebel stronghold of Tarhuna. Eastern Forces commanded by Khalifa Haftar have been engaged in an offensive to seize Tripoli since April. Voters in Tunisia will elect a new president tomorrow. 26 candidates, including the current prime minister and a former president, are vying for the top office. More in this report.
The death of President Beji Caid Essebsi in July forced the elections to be held 3 months earlier than scheduled. The public has been deeply invested in the electoral campaign. Would-be voters flooded the streets of Tunis in jubilant mood yesterday, the final day of campaigning.
We the youth, we are the present and future of Tunisia. On September 15th, we are going to change the reality and change the future of Tunisia with the choice we make. We must not make a dogmatic decision. We must choose the right person for the right position.
Tunisia is the only democracy to emerge from the 2011 Arab Spring, but the North African state is plagued by economic stagnation, security threats, and political instability. Voters are looking to elect a president who can steer Tunisia out of these crises.
The next president must rescue the country from the crisis it is in, especially the economic crisis, the education crisis, which is getting worse compared to previous years. As I said, the economy, the natural resources, which aren't being taken advantage of correctly.
None of the 26 candidates has emerged as the clear front-runner in the recent opinion polls. A runoff vote will be held in November if nobody secures an absolute majority in tomorrow's elections.
Halloween came early to Los Angeles as Universal Studios Hollywood opened the doors on its horror nights. More in this report.
Halloween Horror Nights is an annual event at the amusement park. Classic horror films or television shows are transformed into interactive experiences. The creepy evenings are open at Universal Studios Orlando and Hollywood, with the express intention of scaring the wit out of visitors. People randomly go through a house and hear the lines they want to hear. The result is a maze that does not skimp on the silliness or the screams, whilst guests see some of the best scenes from their favorite movies. Last year, the Stranger Things maze encompassed Season 1, and this year it is all about Season 2 and 3.
I thought it was lovely, really lovely. I mean, it's just very nostalgic, mostly for me. It's just lovely to see the imagery. And what a good job they did.
And it wasn't too scary?
Not too scary for me. The imagery wasn't that surprising. And I was involved in approving it, so I knew sort of what was coming.
After the red carpet, Dan Aykroyd and Ghostbusters director Ivan Reitman dared to try the maze, featuring classic imagery like the green ghost Slimmer and the giant marshmallow man.
I'm excited because, you know, the Ghostbusters comes from research my great-grandfather did in the 1920s into spiritualism. He was kind of serious about the subject, but here we are so many decades later, and it's, you know, 4 movies, record, television shows, and now a maze exhibit. Yeah, it's pretty neat to see how long it's lasted, like the endurance of the thing.
Halloween Horror Nights at Universal Studios Hollywood will run until November 2nd.
And now the weather situation from around the globe. That's all for now. For further updates, stay tuned to Indus News.